The courtroom fell silent as the judge's gavel echoed through the packed chamber. Marcus Rodriguez sat alone at the defendant's table, his weathered hands folded tightly in his lap. The prosecutor's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Your Honor, the defendant stands accused of assault, destruction of property, and disturbing the peace. The evidence is clear and overwhelming." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every stare burning into his back. His court-appointed lawyer shuffled papers nervously, already preparing for defeat. The charges were serious, the circumstances damning. At 62, Marcus faced years behind bars for a moment of rage that had changed everything. "Mr. Rodriguez," the judge began, his voice stern and unforgiving, "you stand accused of attacking 3 men outside a local establishment, causing significant property damage, and creating a public disturbance. How do you plead?" Marcus stood slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Guilty, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. His lawyer's face fell. This wasn't the plan they had discussed. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where we uncover the extraordinary moments that remind us of the power of human connection and the importance of recognizing those who serve others without recognition. Today's story takes us into a courtroom where justice seemed predetermined until an unexpected visitor changed everything. Let's uncover what really happened on that fateful night and why a decorated general would walk into a civilian courtroom to defend a man he'd never met. Marcus Rodriguez had spent 40 years working construction, building bridges and buildings that would outlast him. He was a quiet man who kept to himself, never married, no children. His life revolved around work, his small apartment, and the occasional visit to Murphy's bar down the street. He wasn't a drinker, but he liked the quiet atmosphere and the way the bartender, Sarah, always remembered his order of black coffee and apple pie. What most people didn't know about Marcus was that he carried invisible scars from his service in Afghanistan 20 years earlier. He'd been a combat medic, saving lives under enemy fire, watching young soldiers breathe their last breath in his arms. The nightmares had never stopped, but he'd learned to live with them. On the night that changed everything, Marcus was walking home from Murphy's when he heard screaming from the alley behind the bar. 3 men had cornered Sarah, who was taking out the trash after her shift. They demanded money, her purse, her jewelry. When she resisted, they shoved her to the ground. Marcus didn't think, he didn't plan, he just acted. The first man went down with a single punch that broke his nose. The second stumbled backward, crashing into a stack of empty bottles. The third pulled a knife, but Marcus disarmed him with movements that came from muscle memory and years of military training. When the police arrived, they found 3 men injured and unconscious, Sarah shaken but unharmed, and Marcus standing over them, his knuckles bleeding. The men claimed they were just asking for directions. They said Marcus attacked them unprovoked. With no witnesses except Sarah, whose testimony was dismissed as biased, the case seemed straightforward. Marcus Rodriguez, a man with a history of PTSD, had violently assaulted 3 innocent civilians. The media painted him as a dangerous veteran who couldn't control his rage. The prosecutors used his military background against him, suggesting his training made him a weapon. His lawyer advised him to plead guilty and hope for leniency. Now, standing in that courtroom, Marcus felt more alone than he had in years. Sarah sat in the gallery, tears streaming down her face. But her testimony hadn't been enough. The evidence was circumstantial, but the charges were real. "Your Honor," the prosecutor continued, "the defendant's military training makes him particularly dangerous. His actions that night were calculated and excessive. We recommend the maximum sentence of 15 years. 15 years. At 62, that might as well be a life sentence. Marcus felt his legs weaken, but he remained standing, accepting his fate with the same quiet dignity he'd shown his entire life. The judge was about to respond when the courtroom doors burst open. Every head turned as a tall man in a crisp military uniform strode down the center aisle. The silver stars on his shoulders caught the light, and the ribbons on his chest told stories of battles fought and won. "Your Honor," the general said, his voice commanding the room, "I request permission to address the court." The judge, clearly taken aback, stammered, "General Morrison, this is highly irregular. This is a civilian court, and you have no standing in this case." "Your Honor, I have information crucial to this case, information that could change everything." The prosecutor stood objecting loudly, but the judge raised his hand for silence. The courtroom was electric with tension. Marcus turned to look at the general, confusion written across his face. He'd never seen this man before in his life. "General Morrison, you have 5 minutes," the judge said. The general walked to the center of the courtroom, his bearing proud and dignified. He looked directly at Marcus, then turned to address the judge and jury. "Your Honor, 20 years ago, I was a young lieutenant leading a platoon in the mountains of Afghanistan. We were ambushed during a routine patrol. 3 of my men were critically wounded, and we were pinned down by enemy fire. Our medic had been hit in the first volley. The courtroom was silent, hanging on every word. That's when Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez crawled across 50 yards of open ground under heavy fire to reach us. He treated our wounded while bullets flew over his head. He saved 3 lives that day, including mine. When the medevac couldn't land due to enemy fire, he carried each wounded soldier to safety, one by one. Marcus felt his breath catch. He remembered that day, the weight of wounded soldiers on his back, the sound of bullets whistling past his ears. But he'd never known the name of the young lieutenant he'd helped save. Sergeant Rodriguez was awarded the Silver Star for his actions that day, the general continued. But more importantly, he gave 3 families their sons back. He gave my wife her husband back. He gave my children their father back. The general's voice cracked slightly, but he continued with military composure. 20 years later, I read about this case in the newspaper. I read about a man named Marcus Rodriguez, who was being painted as a dangerous criminal. I couldn't believe it was the same man until I saw his photograph. The same man who risked his life to save strangers is now being condemned for protecting an innocent woman. The prosecutor tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a look. "Your Honor, I've spent my career studying character and courage. The man standing before you is not a criminal. He's a hero who saw someone in danger and acted without thinking of his own safety. That's not the behavior of a violent criminal. That's the behavior of a man who spent his life serving others." The general reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I have here a petition signed by the 43 men who served under Sergeant Rodriguez during his deployment. Each one owes their life to his skill, his courage, and his dedication. They're asking this court to see him as they do, as a man who would rather face danger himself than watch others suffer." Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. He'd lost touch with his unit after returning home, thinking they'd forgotten about him. He'd never imagined they remembered, never imagined they cared. The general turned to face Marcus directly. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you saved my life 20 years ago. Today, I'm here to save yours." The courtroom erupted. People were crying, standing, applauding. The judge called for order, but his own eyes were moist. The prosecutor sat down heavily, his case crumbling around him. Sarah stood up in the gallery, her voice clear and strong. "Your Honor, I need to say something. Those men weren't asking for directions. They were robbing me. They threatened to hurt me if I didn't give them everything I had. Marcus saved my life, just like he saved theirs 20 years ago." The judge looked at the prosecutor, who was shuffling papers frantically. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said weakly, "in light of this new information, the state would like to review the charges." But the judge was already making his decision. "Mr. Rodriguez, please stand." Marcus stood, his legs shaking, the general standing beside him like a guardian angel. "The charges against you are dismissed. This court recognizes that you acted in defense of another person, and your actions, while regrettable, were justified. You are free to go." The courtroom exploded in cheers. Marcus collapsed into his chair, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. The general placed a hand on his shoulder. 20 years ago, you told me that we take care of each other. That's what soldiers do. Well, today, we took care of you. Marcus looked up at the man whose life he'd saved, now grown into a leader who commanded respect and admiration. I never expected to see you again, Marcus whispered. I never forgot you, the general replied. None of us did. As they walked out of the courtroom together, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't alone. The men he'd served with, the lives he'd saved, they remembered. They cared. They'd come to his rescue, just as he'd once come to theirs. Sarah waited for them outside, her face glowing with relief and gratitude. Thank you, she said simply. Both of you. The general shook her hand, then turned to Marcus. There's something else, Sergeant. The men from your unit, they've been looking for you. They want to have a reunion. They want to thank you properly for everything you did. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. For so long he'd carried the weight of his service alone, thinking it had been forgotten, thinking it didn't matter. Now he understood that his actions had rippled through time, touching lives he'd never known about, creating connections that distance and years couldn't break. Months later, Marcus stood before a gathering of veterans at the American Legion Hall. The men he'd served with had aged, but their faces lit up when they saw him. They shared stories, laughed at old memories, and thanked him for the gift of life he'd given them. But the most powerful moment came when the general presented him with a framed photograph of the unit, signed by every man who'd served under him. At the bottom, in bold letters, were the words, "A hero then, a hero now, a hero always." Marcus hung the photograph in his small apartment, where it reminded him daily that his life had meaning, that his service mattered, that he was part of something larger than himself. The incident that had nearly destroyed him had instead reconnected him with his purpose. He began volunteering at the Veterans Administration Hospital, helping other former soldiers deal with their own invisible wounds. He shared his story at high schools, teaching young people about service and sacrifice. And every week, he stopped by Murphy's bar, where Sarah would serve him his black coffee and apple pie. They'd talk about their families, their dreams, their fears. Two people who'd found each other in a moment of crisis, bound together by an act of courage that had saved them both. The general kept his promise too. He visited Marcus every few months, and they'd walk through the city, talking about their experiences, their hopes for the future. The young lieutenant who'd been saved had become a mentor and friend to the medic who'd saved him. Marcus learned that the three men who'd attacked Sarah had been arrested on previous charges and were now serving time for their crimes. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the truth had been revealed. The story of Marcus Rodriguez reminds us that heroism isn't always recognized in the moment. Sometimes it takes years for the full impact of our actions to be understood. Sometimes the people we help disappear from our lives, and we never know how we've changed their world. But in a universe guided by connection and gratitude, those acts of courage create invisible threads that bind us together across time and distance. When we serve others without expectation of reward, when we risk our own safety to protect the innocent, when we stand up for what's right even when we're afraid, we plant seeds that may not bloom for decades. Marcus Rodriguez stood alone in that courtroom, facing a future that seemed hopeless, but he wasn't really alone. He was connected to every life he'd touched, every person he'd saved, every moment of courage he'd shown. And when he needed them most, they appeared, led by a general who'd never forgotten the medic who'd carried him to safety. The truth has a way of revealing itself when we need it most. Love has a way of returning when we've given up hope. And sometimes, just sometimes, the people we've helped along the way appear in our darkest hour to remind us that our lives have mattered, our service has been seen, and our courage has made a difference. In a world that often feels disconnected and cold, stories like Marcus Rodriguez's remind us that we're all connected by invisible threads of kindness, courage, and love. When we pull on those threads, when we reach out to help others, we strengthen the web that holds us all together. That's the power of gratitude. That's the strength of service. That's the magic that happens when we remember that we're all in this together, and that taking care of each other isn't just what soldiers do, it's what human beings do. Today, remember the Marcus Rodriguezes in your life. Remember the people who've served you, protected you, helped you when you needed it most. And remember that your own acts of courage and kindness are creating ripples that will return to you in ways you can't imagine. Because in the end, we're all connected, we all matter, and we all have the power to save each other.